Hi, I'm Tracy Wallace. I'm the content director for Microsoft at INE, and I want to take some time, a few minutes, just to talk to you about some things you might want to know about the Azure administrator and architect roles. And what we're going to talk about, the first thing we're going to talk about is what are those roles? Okay? And really, to talk about those roles, I want to first start out with talking about what role-based learning is, and that's a topic that's been kind of hot in the industry, in the training industry, for several years now. And what does it mean? Okay, so what is role-based learning? Okay, well, the first thing is that the idea is rather than having the training concepts defined by vendors, they're really defined by customers, by the IT industry, right? By the people that are using the technology, that need people skilled in these technologies every day. Okay, and so the idea is to really start out with this very real world approach to training, and that means that these are designed to align with industry defined roles. That's a good thing. Okay, and another thing that's really important, it's subtle and it's nearly impossible to do fully, it's more of a concept, I think, is to teach roles rather than products. Now, when I say that, okay, it's a great concept. And things like, for example, a cloud administrator, that's a role that is really fairly generic and fairly applicable across the board, right? And so if I'm an administrator in Azure, I'm probably doing very similar things in terms of responsibilities as somebody who's doing it in AWS. But the reality is that the skills that I need in Azure are Azure skills, and the skills that I need in AWS are AWS skills. So there's a blend, and I think it's more a matter of the approach as opposed to saying, okay, everything's just going to be completely product and vendor neutral, because that's frankly nearly impossible. Okay, and then the other thing that's really important is that, if you're looking at certification, these certifications that get defined from role-based learning, because they start with the industry specifications, they're really aligned better with industry requirements than maybe traditional vendor-based training is and vendor-based certification. Now, what does all this really mean? Okay, what does this really provide? And I say this as somebody who has been training for over 25 years, and I've seen a lot of different frameworks. And I will tell you that role-based learning is not materially different to me than any other kind of learning. But it starts with a very logical framework, and I think that's what's important about role-based learning, and what's effective about it is just really its starting point. And what I'd like to do, though, is take a couple minutes now to talk about two key roles in the Azure environment. Okay? And the first role that I'm going to talk about is the Azure administrator role. And this role, okay, is really designed for people that are going to implement and monitor and really have that day-to-day interaction with Azure. Of course, you can also see that it doesn't necessarily pay too poorly either. Now, one thing about anytime you look at average salaries, you can get a source from that, but you also have to take it into account that, to me, that's just a relative measure, right? Say, okay, hey, this is going to make $124,000 average. What does that mean? Well, it means probably if you are an Azure administrator, you're probably going to be making more than someone who makes $60,000 as their average role, but also probably less than most professional athletes, and that falls somewhere in there. But it's a relative measure as far as I'm concerned. But again, what are you doing? You're doing the day-to-day. You're implementing, monitoring, maintaining. You are deploying and supporting infrastructure solution, and also providing any technical assistance that's needed for cloud-based systems. And so that's what the Azure administrator is doing. Now, what about the architect? Okay. The Azure architect role, as you might expect, an architect's going to have a little bit higher average salary. Again, this is all a relative measure. Okay. And the idea is that the architect is there to deploy and oversee the computing strategy, right? So you're looking at cloud adoption plans, migration plans, the design of applications to take best advantage of the cloud, right? And really understanding all of the components across the breadth of the cloud capabilities. And of course, if we're talking about Azure, we're talking about that in the framework of the Azure architecture or your application architecture within Azure. So that's the first thing that you need to know about these Azure roles is what are the roles, what is expected. So your Azure administrator, that's your day-to-day, similar in many ways to what you would expect for an on-premises administrator, although the roles are going to diverge a little bit and typically be a little bit broader, and that's really just the nature of the cloud. Now, what's the next thing that we want to talk about? And that is, okay, that's what the role is. But dive in a little deeper, what are the responsibilities for these roles? And let's start out with the responsibilities for the Azure administrator role. What are the administrator focuses? Okay. Well, one of the key things, and I always use this as a starting point, is identity. Okay. Azure has Azure Active Directory, usually referred to as Azure AD. It is a critical component in Azure, not only used for Azure, but also used for a lot of third-party environments. In fact, I get a lot of Azure people who are coming and learning about Azure, not because they expect to deploy workloads in Azure, but because, for example, they're using Microsoft 365 and they have heard something about Azure AD. So very critical, right? But then a lot of the other components are really pretty standard. For example, networking. You've got networking on premises. You have networking in the Azure environment. It's different. There's a good chance, for example, that you've got the same people managing your networking and your compute services, where oftentimes, because of the complexity, if you're doing all the physical management, those may be separated. Now, you could probably see those as being part of the same role. And the same thing for storage, right? And you think, okay, on premises, those are, again, probably three different roles. But oftentimes, those are roles that are really combined in the Azure administrator. You also have some things you would probably think are a little more common and across the board, things like monitoring all of these different resources, and also protecting these resources, making sure that all data is properly backed up, that it is recoverable, and that you've got good disaster recovery and business continuity capabilities. So those are the broad roles for Azure administrators. What about Azure architects? What are our broad Azure architect roles, okay, and responsibilities? Okay, first of all, in general, the definition of the management, not the day-to-day management, but defining the components for management. So defining things like design of your policies and design of your monitoring and choices for what you're going to use for monitor. Okay, on the identity and security, right, defining, for example, what are the conditional access policies that are going to be needed, what type of monitoring and auditing is needed for identity and for application security, what are the choices that are going to be made, for example, for SEIM tools, security, event, and incident management. Okay. Also, applications. Not only what applications you're running, but how you're running them. Are you expecting to look at platform as a service or infrastructure as a service? And how are you migrating functionality that maybe was running on a virtual machine, but maybe doesn't need to be on a virtual machine in the Azure environment? Also, data. Now, how deep a particular Azure architect goes into data architecture probably is going to be very dependent, but understanding what the data platform options are and being able to assist with the design of database systems is very important. Designing an overall business continuity, and again, you can see a lot of overlap here, where the administrator is going to be the one that is implementing the business continuity, but the architect is going to be the one that is actually defining it. Okay? And not surprisingly, the definition of the infrastructure, the design, the management, and the monitoring of infrastructure. All of those things really fall under architects. So again, you can kind of see that primary difference, even though there's a lot of overlap. Again, day to day, that's you're looking at the administrator, and defining and designing and possibly implementing, you're looking at the architect. Okay, so those are probably the two biggest roles that you'll typically see in the cloud and certainly in an Azure. Now, the third thing that I'd like to talk about is how can we, as I&E, help you out with this, right? How can I&E help? Well, we have two complete learning paths. We have an Azure Administrator Learning Path, okay? And we have an Azure Architect learning path. Okay, for administrator, there's 6 courses. There's over 30 hours of videos, quiz questions, so you can test your knowledge on it, and also hands-on tasks. And for Azure Architect, we have 10 courses. We actually have over 50 hours of video. We have quiz questions, and we also have hands-on tasks for that. Okay, let's take a look at some more of the detail of the Azure Administrator Learning Path first. First of all, identity management and governance. That's going to be one of the key elements in the Azure Administrator Learning Path. So things like resource management, governance, and basic identity management. Okay, we also have monitoring and protection of resources. Okay, and so general monitoring, things like using tools like log analytics, also looking at recovery and protection of the data through backup services. We have compute management. Day-to-day compute management for Azure administrators, deploying virtual machines, managing virtual machines, also looking at the platform as a service, application services, container management if you have containerized solutions. Okay? Also, virtual network management. And again, virtual network management is very different than on-premises network management because this really is your software-defined networking, 100%. You're never doing any physical networking. You're never dealing with switches, right? So provisioning networks, managing DNS, and other networking services, and access to the networks and protection of the networks and the resources that are connected to that network. And finally, in Azure Administrator, storage management. What is storage management? What are the storage options? What are file operations? How do you protect data? And also, how do you migrate data? All right, and so those are the broad elements of the Azure Administrator Learning Path that we have at INE. Now, I want to take just a moment to talk about the Azure Architect. Now, this is a, frankly, larger and wider learning path. And in fact, it actually has 2 components. It has an implementation component and a design. And the implementation component has some overlap, and you'll certainly see that, not only overlap between what's in the admin and what's in the architect, but also what's in the implementation and what's in the design of the architect. So we have infrastructure management and monitoring. We have management and security solutions, which again, if you look at that, is very similar to what we have. Again, it's just looking at it from an initial as opposed to an ongoing standpoint. Defining applications, looking at web apps, looking at serverless compute options like function apps and logic apps, and also the variety of container solutions, whether it's container instances or if it's a managed Kubernetes cluster that's being managed by Azure and you're running your workloads on those. Those are application design concepts that an architect needs to be familiar with. Okay, and then we also have the data platforms. In a very broad sense, what are the relational database platforms that are available in the Azure environment? And also, what are the non-relational platforms that are available? So things like MongoDB, things like CosmoDB. What are the options that you have to host workloads in the Azure environment? Okay, and next, I want to talk about that second part of the Azure Architect learning path, which is design. Okay, and so looking at things like designing business continuity and designing scale, okay? Actually designing the infrastructure. So, thinking about, okay, what is the best way to implement compute? Do we need to be able to scale? How do we need to be able to do that? What is the most efficient way to design our networks? Okay, how are we going to manage our workload across an entire deployed infrastructure that's in the cloud? Okay. And monitoring. And one of the really key things when you're talking about monitoring is optimizing your consumption. And that is a huge issue in the cloud, right? Because you don't want to just take everything you've got on premises that's already running and just take it as is and figure out, okay, I need X number of VMs because that's how many I have on premises, and let me pop those in and start running them in the cloud. Okay. But really thinking about, okay, how can I reduce the costs, the monthly costs, the ongoing costs that I have of these solutions in the cloud? And also standard monitoring and designing auditing is huge. Okay? And in general, identity and security. So designing the authentication, going well beyond just saying that people are going to use Azure AD. How are you going to integrate applications? What requirements are you going to have for authentication? What are the policies that need to be designed, that need to be enforced from a business requirements standpoint? And of course, how are you going to secure your applications that are now running outside of your physical data center? Okay, and finally, looking at designing your data storage. So thinking about things like SQL databases, Azure SQL databases. Also, very big concept, data encryption, right? Keeping your data safe. How are you going to make sure that you design that into the really original basis of any solution that's going into the Azure environment? Right? And then also big data solutions. So things like their Hadoop, Azure's Hadoop implementation called HD Insight, or what is now called Azure Synapse, which is their data warehousing and migration or movement tools suite. So a lot of different topics that you'll see across these roles and even within the roles, but you'll also see a fair bit of overlap. And we've got these roles covered. We've got training leading towards Microsoft certification for these roles covered at INE. So if this is training that you're interested in, please come over to INE.com, take a look, grab a subscription, and start learning these roles for Azure. Thank you very much.